So now we've got Jonathan Kelly from Anthemis Group. Is that right? Anthemis, brilliant. And he's going to talk to us about building charts with React and D3. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yep. So hello, everyone. My name's Jonathan Kelly, and as I said, I work at Anthemis Group. And I am here to talk to you today about charts in React with D3. So I think it's pretty safe to say that creating charts is quite complicated. So in this talk, I'm hoping to show you some different ways that you can create charts in React in the hope that it will give you a starting point from which you can build your own charts in React. So why am I talking about this, and what started this story off for me? So recently at Anthemis Group, I inherited a project that was written by a contractor. It was a prototype, and it was written in Ruby, Ember, and D3. And this prototype that I inherited was basically all revolved around this one big chart that when I saw it, well, kind of slightly died on the inside because it was 1,280 lines of JavaScript for just the chart in D3, and I had no experience in D3, no experience in Ember, and no experience in Ruby. So the story from this is basically my experience of rewriting this from the ground up, and I decided to write that in React with D3, with Redux, with all of the toys that come out with that. So that's kind of where this started from. And it's now not 1,280 lines of JavaScript in one file, which is nice. A lot more easier to maintain and test and everything like that. So I started off this search for a solution to my problem. And as we all do before we get started with that, we think about what our requirements are. So as I mentioned before, I wanted all the DOM manipulation to be done by React. I didn't want D3, I didn't want to just integrate D3 and React and have D3 manage its own version of the DOM and then React doing its own bit. I wanted all of the rendering to be handled directly by React. I wanted all of the state to be contained within React and or Redux as necessary. And I didn't want D3 to hold its own version of the state that I would then have to reconcile and anything like that. It would just be complicated. Didn't want to do that. Wasn't even an option for me right at the beginning. I wanted it to be flexible. So what I mean by that in terms of charts is if you want to do like a pie chart or a bar chart or a really simple thing like that, then you can just use a library, and they're really great for doing those sort of things. But if you want to go slightly outside of the scope of that, then they quickly become, it's not what you're really looking for when you're trying to do things like that. And then the other thing, which none of the other things I could find at the moment at that time did, was supporting drag and drop. Because the chart I had was interactive, which was one of the other reasons for using Redux and a couple of other things. So I could add time traveling and an undo redo button, which was kind of more for show than actually much functionality. But yeah. So I did what all of us would probably do when entered into this conundrum, entered into a heavy Googling session, followed by lots of Stack Overflow, lots of looking at libraries, anything like that. Just anything to help me get inspired and look at all of the different options that are out there. So in terms of libraries, they're kind of split into two types, I thought. So the first type is integrating your pure D3 that you've already previously written into React. So this uses like another fake DOM that will then come back as a React component, as far as I understand it. I wrote these off pretty early because it wasn't what I wanted to use. But if you've already got a chart that's written extensively in D3, then you could use this to port it over and use it in React if you wanted to. So these are a couple of examples of libraries that will let you do this. D3 React and React Fake DOM are written by the same person, and the third one, the Fake DOM one, was his improvement upon the previous. But that's kind of where that category of library comes from. The next one is React charting libraries. So there's a few here. The first two are written on top of React file DOM or fake DOM that I mentioned in the previous slide, and then are rendered like that. And the other two, Recharts and Victory, they are not. They're written as separate React components in the style that I want to do them. I don't think at the time when I was looking around for these that I actually found any of these. Some of these examples are things I found after having already searched. So I started to look at blog posts or anything to get some inspiration about what other people have been using or what other people were thinking about. And around the same time, I read this post. I don't need to go into it because I'll be covering how to do this a little bit later. But it covered the way in which that I wanted to approach this coding. And I thought that was really great. So it kind of led me and supported my idea of what I wanted to do and how I wanted that to work. So that was the solution. But we all know, as with anything in the development world, there's like 5,000 ways to do anything. So just because this was the one that worked for me doesn't mean that I'm saying don't use any of the others, don't use them. Just use whatever you need to for the bit that you're doing. So to sum up the bit that I'm using, it's using D3 for math and then React for state and DOM. I'll go into more in a little bit exactly what that means, exactly how that works. But the general gist is that there's a lot in terms of what's in D3 that's really nice to leverage. For instance, the pie chart library, you can just throw an array out and it will return you all of the angles of a pie chart that you can then render on a page. And you don't need to go off and work that out or redo that yourself. You can just use bits and pieces for that. And in the latest version of D3 v4, all of the D3 library has been split up into lot smaller modules. So there is like a D3 pie and there is a D3 drag that you can just bring in those smaller ones rather than the massive great big library that it is itself. So we can now jump into some live coding. So hopefully everything won't explode. So the first chart that I'm doing is it's a pretty simple one. So it is just this pie chart, which I know it's not very exciting or anything like that, but it's a simple place to get started to go over some of the concepts of this. As you can see, it's not, probably can't see any of that. There we go. It's not a particularly complicated chart example. So, but what I wanted to just explain about this method to just show that there's no magic going on or anything like that, is just to copy the output and render it into this basic chart. Pie chart goes here. That's me being really sorry. Basic pie chart. So these projects, I will send out the links to these later on. I will send out the links to these later on, like I said. So I've got quite a few coding demos, and I probably won't get a chance to cover all of them, but I will send the links out later if anyone wants to go see them or anything like that, and I might add a couple more going on going forward. They're all created as separate web applications using Create React App, and then just because it's simple, easy to get going, and that part of it's not really what I want to be covering today. So to start with, this is the app component. Sorry, I've got to zoom in on each bit. I'll try to remember. Someone shout at me if I forget to zoom in, which is just rendering your pie chart. So if I go into the pie chart and just paste in the code that I have copied, I then need to fix the differences. Bear with me while I do this. goes to and I forgot to put, as with any live coding, you always forget to do something, don't you? There we go. So there's no magic to it. All I wanted to show is that there's no magic with this method. It's not like creating some crazy thing. It's just trying to replicate what D3 does, but within inside React itself. And I don't really like the D3 API. It's really hard to read and and hard to do. So this is a bit of an improvement. So if we take this example, which is pretty much entirely hard-coded. So then the next stage I went on to is, well, how can I make that so that I can change the data? So obviously this is already a component and everything. So if I can just pass in my data as a prop, and then I could just be able to render directly from that, which is what the next pie chart, which again just says pie chart goes here, really, really, really original. So this time I'll go more into how to translate between D3 and into React, because this is something that I found was slightly difficult to get my head around at first, because the APIs are quite different. I don't know how many people have used D3, but it's got some real weird ways of doing things, and I hadn't used it at all before, so I was a bit like, what's that method doing? Like, there's nothing with the class that exists like that. What's enter? What's raise? What's it doing? So I really didn't know. But I've now got a little bit of a better understanding. So a lot of this is just going to be copying and pasting in. So the first thing that the chart does is set up its width, height, and radius for the chart. There's nothing too complicated going on there. So you've got your width, height, and your radius. The next thing that is set up are your colors. So, as I mentioned before, I've just literally copied the colors in. So as I mentioned before, D3 is split up into many other components. So you can bring in smaller, sorry, I haven't zoomed in again. You can just bring in the little bits that you want rather than having to bring in the whole library. So I think this is in here. Yeah. So you can work with it. This is what I was meaning about some of the translation between the API. The other thing I had to cope with is the fact that the chart I inherited was written in version 3 of D3, and the one that I've done is now in version 4, which then meant I had even more things to deal with. So you've now got your color set up, and but the color bit basically controls the color of each segment. The next thing is to include the arc that sorry, I'm going to have to rename this to... So that arc is the arc of which the data, the actual pie chart will sit on. It will make sense a bit later. I'm not quite sure, still not quite sure on entirely what some of the semantics are behind D3. So then you've got your label arc, which again is pretty much the same. And then... Right, then you've got your pie chart, and this is the function like I was mentioning before. You can use it to, if I import pie chart. So you can use this to throw in your data, and then it will return you back. Sorry, it will return you back all of the angles and everything that all of your data relates to, based on the values. So it is quite nice in the fact it will work that all out for you, and you don't need to worry about it. So I've copied in pie chart. Right, so the next thing that's on this list is this bit, which is where we change a bit of tact. So this is where D3 is selecting the body element, depending on an SVG, and then setting the width and the height. However, we don't need to do that because we're working with React, so we just return an SVG, and we can just set the width on and the height just like we would with any other element or attribute that we're doing. So already I find that a little bit simpler and a little bit nicer on the eye and following more on the standard of all the other components that you're making, whereas that doesn't. And yeah, so and then we're adding on a G. G in SVG is I'm not massively into the whole SVG standard, but I think it just is for grouping elements together. I've got a nod in the front row, so I've got that one right. So tick for me. So the next thing as part of this is it transforms the grouping. So the point for this one is the transform translate. It moves it from the top left, I believe it is, into the center. I got another nod as well. God, it's almost like I know some of this stuff. And again, this is all within the same way that you would be creating it before. So we got width divided by 2, and then we have height divided by 2. And that's it to get your SVG set up in terms of the height and everything. It is there, but obviously we haven't drawn anything yet. I could expect it, but I mean, it's hardly worth the effort. So in the actual app, I have already set up I've copied in the data. So I'll just go back and just show you that at the bottom there's this CSV data. I have already copied that into my app component and passed it down as a prop, so that I don't have to worry about that. Data. So next thing we do is not that. Okay, yep, sorry. So pie chart. So we invoke the pie chart function, passing in the data, which will return an array of the chart itself with all of the angles on it. So all we need to do, which is much the same as anything else we've done, is then just write that to a component. I'll just check in which bit they do. So there's another G with a class name of arc. So as I say, this isn't like rocket science, it's the translation between the two of them, and it is quite annoying, even though this is just a basic pie chart, to even go through some of this can be quite cumbersome. So the other thing you then need to do is you then need to set up your path. So the path, well, I'll just draw it, and then we'll get to that. Yeah. And then we fill which should have done something. It's fine though. I do have the coding sample because I thought I might break something / forget something. So I just wanted to check that. Sorry? Oh, okay. Thank you. Right, tell you what. Let's do what all great live coders do. Look, I've done it! It was working earlier, I promise. Works on my machine. Right, okay, so I didn't pass it through the arc function, so yeah, apologies for that. So the arc function then will return based on the parameters you set. It will return the values that you need to render into D. As I said, I'm not massively too sure on the SVG specs, but I've just gone through the pie chart example and then re-rendered using React these bits and pieces, and then there's a text example which then renders your labels as well. So as you can see, that is a little bit longer in terms of code than the pie chart example was, but the output of what is rendered, I think, well at least I think, is actually a lot more readable than if we go back and look at the pie chart example over here. And because everything's now in React, we can leverage some of the stuff that we use for other parts of our React library. So given how that went, I might just be brave and just reset these. It's not too important. But the idea for the next one was that you might want your chart to be responsive based on your window resizing. Might be a requirement, and I wouldn't be too sure how to do that in D3, but I could leverage what I've already done before using React to go out and go, well, I know there's a library called React Dimensions, which will return you the absolute value, the width and the height of the element that it's in, which then allows you to, which I've shown, which is in here. You can then import in React Dimensions, like I mentioned, and it's a higher order component that you can add on to your app, which then gives you the props of container width, container height. You can then amend your pie chart to add on the props taking width and height. What you then have to do is to make it scalable so that all you have to do is worry about the width and the height is you set the view box on your SVG. So what the view box does is when you say the view box size, and that's the size at which you're drawing the SVG, and then the width and the height is the actual thing that you want it to be displayed at, which means that you don't have to worry about, oh, what's the radius is 20, oh, the screen's twice as high, twice as big, I now want the radius to be 40. You don't worry about that. You just say, I need it this width and this height, and this is what I'm drawing it at. So it's really useful to start with building it with without a view box, without the responsiveness, and then tagging that on later. Which then means you get something like this, which is, again, it's exactly the same chart, and you can, so long as you can get hold of the windows, drag it around, and it will respawn, which is quite nice. So, some of the other things, I don't need to open email. Why am I opening email? Given out some of those other demos, I'm just going to undo most of these, and I will talk through some of the code. So, some of the other things I mentioned, so that's it in terms of a pie chart. It's a really basic pie chart, but it gets you started with that, and then you can build on and add as much customization as you want. Because typically with charts, you could change anything. You could change the colors. You could change just about anything. So it's just about starting as small as you could need and then building out from there. Obviously, if all you're doing is building a pie chart, you probably want to just use a library for that. So the next thing that I mentioned that I needed as part of mine was drag and drop. So I found an example that used drag and drop. Again, this is a really simple one. It's just dragging some circles around on the screen. So I'd used React D&D before, a library by Dan Abramoff, I was like, oh, great, I can just use that. Unbeknownst to me that HTML5 drag and drop doesn't support SVGs. So turns out I couldn't. And I had to go and find another option. You can do, there are some other ways around it if you use some different backends, but out of the box, it doesn't really support it. So I was looking around for some other ways to do it, and the one I ended up going for was that D3 has its own drag and drop. But what I wanted to make sure is go back to where I set my requirements or what I wanted to do, and actually make sure it's still fitted with those things. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't doing any of the DOM manipulation. It didn't keep its own internal state, and I wanted to just make sure that that was happening. And luckily enough, I could make it work without doing any of those things, which is great. So this is the first example from circle dragging, as said in there. So the idea for the circle dragging one, if I just show you, every single time you refresh, the circles are in a random position to start with. So the first part of the app from this one is just setting up some of those things. The state for the initial circles, as displayed here, is literally just setting up those random ones. So it's pretty pointless to go through that. So I've then got some methods for the drag and start drop, but it's better if I go down into circles. Just wraps up and just creates a circle for each circle that are in there. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So if I drop down into the circle, the reason that I put the this code down into the circle and made it a stateful component rather than stateless is you're adding event listeners to the DOM, which then means you want to tidy up after yourself. So like a good React coder, I have my component will unmount to remove my my DOM, my event listeners. Otherwise the React gods will shout at me. So it's a little bit strange to get started, a little bit different. So the circle itself is really simple. It just returns a circle based on some props you've passed in. There's an ID, there's a color with a default, its position, its radius. Whether it's active in this instance is, are you actively dragging it? Which then adds a class which sets which changes it to that sort of stroke around the outside. So when I was looking at how the D3 library worked in terms of dragging and dropping, this is what I ended up coming up with. One thing was a little weird in terms of how this event object actually ended up bubbling up, because that's the one that contains the X and the Y coordinates for where it is as you're dragging it, which you just import at the top, and it contains the actual X and Y coordinates that, so I wasn't too sure. I imagine it's some sort of global singleton instance that then knows what the event is and can pass that back up. The other things that were slightly annoying is it has its own this, which was then really annoying because I couldn't use arrow functions, and I like arrow functions. Yeah, so you've got like a standard thing. You are selecting using D3 select, and then this is the ID of the circle, and then you're calling onto that selection, the drag function, and then you've got an on-start event, an on-drag event, and then an on-end event. And then all of this is doing is then calling back up the props that are passed down to it. So again, this is all like simple and exactly the same way that we do any other like React components. There's still like nothing much magical apart from maybe some of this select stuff. It's all still nice and in keeping with the React way, I guess. So if we go back up to the app, you can tell I use a bit of Redux because I am applying my updates in the same manner. So what comes in on the drag start is the ID. It returns back up the DOM element, of which you can just grab the ID, go through your list of circles, and add and set the active to true. Yeah, definitely in the Redux form. And then you just set your state. And all that will do is when you start dragging, it will then set that circle's active flag to true. And then the flip side of that, the onDrag just does the inverse. So the onDrag event is that's where your X and your Y coordinates get thrown back up. You get the first property again is the DOM element, which you can just grab the ID from. Then the second one you get is your drag event, the thing I was mentioning before, where there's this weird sort of global event. You can then grab your X and Y coordinates off that, and then just update your circle. So it's pretty easy, and it's still there's no state. All the states still managed in React, and D3 isn't manipulating the DOM because the actual movement is contained within here. By changing the X and the Y coordinates, that's what's causing it to move. So you get this nice little thing. And if I take out the X and Y just to prove that it is in fact that's doing it, all it does is set active to true and then turn it off. So that's like a bit more advanced in terms of some movements with circles. It means you can go as complicated as you like on this onDrag. So as part of mine, I had really strict boundaries in terms of where I could move things to. So to take this from a simple example, you can add a couple of boundaries. I won't go too much into it, but you can add the boundaries in terms of setting your minimum X and your minimum Y based on the radius, and then your maximum X and your maximum Y based on the width and height minus the radius, which then means you can then bound it within the space of the app. So this can get as complicated as you like. I had some fairly complicated logic in mind because the drag and drop comes back as X and Y coordinates, but I needed mine to be I couldn't guarantee what the size of my chart would be, and X and Y are absolutes in terms of it's exactly here. So I needed something that was relative, so I had to change it into angles and distance, which then meant you could persist it to the database, and if you change the overall size of your chart, because it's just an angle and a relative distance, you can then just redraw it exactly where it needs to go without actually too much complications. So to take this further, because it's now in state and everything like that you're managing it, I'll skip the simple Redux one, but it means that you can push your changes of when you're moving things around into Redux, which then means you can leverage all the Redux community. So as you can see here, there's these magical undo, redo buttons, which we can all sort of really easy to guess what they're going to do. So the point is you drag it around, and then you can move things around on there, which might not be so great for just dragging around some circles, but if you've got a really complicated app and you want people to be able to undo and redo things based on that, then this is really useful. And obviously, Redux Undo is not the only library to do with Redux, but there's many others, and you can use or leverage all of those as well because your state's now in there, which makes it a lot more powerful than just using just D3 on its own or anything like that. So that's it for my failed live coding. So to sum up, in terms of the things that I've covered, I went more in depth on the D3 for math, and then the React for your state and DOM manipulations. I touched on the React charting libraries like Victory and Recharts, and then touched on the integrating pure D3 with React. The reason for going more into the first one is that's the most complicated one. The other ones have like docs and everything like that you can just go look at and go like, oh, that's how you do it, and just use them. Whereas that one required some more thinking in terms of how you do it. It is quite difficult sometimes to transition between D3, the D3 code itself, and into React. But I feel that having done it and done a big chart with it, it's really much better than it would be in D3. Everything can be done in little components. Again, just it's doing everything the same way you do with all your React stuff, but with charts. So when your chart becomes more expansive and is built from loads of components, it's done in exactly the same way. It's just rendering into your SVG instead of just divs. And that's all it ends up being. Yes, SVG is slightly more complicated than just divs, but it's the same point. So what's next, and what haven't I covered, and what might I look at doing in the future? Animations. There's probably someone will mention how do you do animations in this. I haven't looked at it, but I know the Victory charting library does do animations. Performance. So if anyone's done some work with SVGs, SVGs have their own performance limit anyway. Beyond like several thousand elements on there, that it has its own performance issues. But I'm not too sure. I haven't run any benchmarks in terms of what's the performance with React versus D3. And then no D3. So just completely getting rid of it and just rolling out your own stuff or using a different charting library. It's not that I'm saying you must use D3. You can use this with, I imagine, any of the other ones to just create some charts, but it's a nice way to just go through how you can create your charts in React. And yeah, thanks for listening. There's links to the presentation and the code samples. Thank you.
Questions to the mic, please, if you want to. You have to go to that microphone, yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, does this work with React Native, or are you planning to make it work with React Native?
That's missing off the list of what's next. I know Victory does do React Native as well, but it's not something I'm yet to try any React Native coding. So yeah, that's definitely in the what's next category.
Hi, John. Unfortunately, this might not be an easy one.
Uh-oh.
You're very coupled to D3 in your particular examples. Did you find that coupling with D3 made your code hard to unit test?
Did I find it hard to unit test? I guess so. I didn't do too much unit testing, which would probably tell you not so much.
So it's non-trivial.
Yeah, but if you deep rendered it and then did snapshotting, they are pure. So the pie chart you saw was a pure pie chart. How many iterations of pie chart you want to test might be up to you, but you could still snapshot, deep render and then snapshot your pie charts, for instance, which would then negate the need. The testing would then be a bit easier in terms of that.
Well, that's a really good answer, so I'm disappointed. Thanks.
Thanks for the talk. Quick question on performance. If you are to change transform to transform 3D, will it be a quick win?
I don't know is the honest answer.
So you'll be using GPU instead.
I don't know is the honest answer. I hadn't done much charting before this. I didn't find with the app that I built that I had any performance limitations for myself. It wasn't a massive app with thousands of things. It had like hundreds of things, but it worked for what I needed to, so I didn't need to explore any other things. That's why I put it in the next thing. I knew a performance thing would come up, but what was the other one you were talking about? It was... That's it. Okay.
Any more? Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Cheers.
Thank you.